I'm going to talk, I guess, quite broadly about some of the projects I've been engaged with over the last decade, with a strong focus on the value of listening and interdisciplinarity, and especially community engagement in the process. So I'm just going to screen share some slides so I can guide us through. And I'm joining you today from southeast Queensland in Australia, from Gubbi Gubbi country. And I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm talking to you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This is the Maroochydore River, not far from where I am right now on Gubbi Gubbi country, and a really important site for a lot of the research I've been engaged with. And I also wanted to acknowledge Lyndon Davis, who's a Gubbi Gubbi emerging elder and a cultural leader in the region, and someone that I've been really privileged to collaborate with for over 15 years now. And Lyndon has been an incredibly generous source of knowledge in some of my approaches to listening and the way that we've designed some of these projects. He's taught me a lot about listening in the field, this idea that, you know, we can listen with our whole bodies, not just our ears, and the way that listening can really be a tool to connect communities to country, to connect communities to place in new ways. So, my background is really as a field recordist, and I'm a classically trained musician. So, I've really come into the world of bioacoustics and ecoacoustics from a creative perspective, with that background in music and sound design. And over the last 15 years, almost 20 now, I've really focused around exploring different approaches to recording ecosystems across the planet, and how those recordings of ecosystems can be a tool for us to really learn about the health of environments, but how those recordings and that process of recording can be a tool for communities to engage in place, in conservation, and in new ways of listening as a way to inspire activism and ecological engagement. And so that process has really led me on various paths of developing different education programs and curriculum for schools and universities around bioacoustics and ecoacoustics with a creative focus. And it's also led me to work on various projects really looking at the potential of bioacoustics in particular in a community engagement context. And I think what's most inspired me over the last decade is now we have these incredible devices like the ones made by Frontier Labs here in southeast Queensland, and of course the Audio Moth, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, and a whole range of other devices available now which make bioacoustics and recording of different ecosystems across the planet increasingly accessible, affordable, non-invasive, and now we're at the point where, you know, the science is truly recognized as a valuable way to monitor environmental health. And so this idea, I guess, of really leveraging the opportunities of these non-invasive recording devices really comes to fruition in a project like Biosphere Soundscapes, which, as Ben mentioned at the start, is a project that I've been leading in collaboration with UNESCO for over a decade now. And this project really started as a way to understand the changing soundscapes of UNESCO biosphere reserves, as a way to connect communities to what it actually means to live in a biosphere reserve, but to understand those environmental patterns and changes in a non-invasive way. And so this project basically has multiple layers, and it does have that kind of scientific focus at the core, but ultimately this project was always about community engagement and really amplifying the possibilities of bioacoustics and acoustic ecology, and generating as much interest and engagement in this field as we possibly could. So the kind of foundational structure of this project was about running residencies, these community engagement residencies where we brought in international artists, scientists, and researchers to work directly with local communities in the Biosphere Reserve. This had a strong focus on creative outcomes, some that I'll talk about in more detail in a moment, but how we can actually share those recordings, share those soundscapes with local and global audiences. This also involved running local masterclasses and labs around specific areas of interest to the community. So if the community group came to us with a desire to focus purely on freshwater ecoacoustics or hydrophone intensives, then we were able to design a masterclass specifically around that. We've run an international internship program for a number of years, which has been on a slight hiatus for the last few years during COVID, but an international internship program that essentially allows researchers and emerging specialists from different parts of the world to come and work on biosphere soundscapes projects. And then naturally biodiversity monitoring at the heart of this, and a global sound map, which has had various iterations over the last few years, but a new version that will be launching soon, which is really connecting to this database of soundscapes we've been working on and becoming another exciting aspect of what's really happening globally at the moment with so much interest and engagement in these fields of bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. And that last point there around designation and policy is perhaps one of the most exciting and unexpected outcomes of the project, in seeing how different biosphere reserves around the world engaging with biosphere soundscapes and having these high profile public outcomes has actually inspired other regions to look at what it means to be a biosphere reserve, what value that can bring to conservation in their own communities, and then actually going through the process of applying to be a biosphere reserve as a result of engaging with this project. So for me, that's the best possible outcome if we can see an increase in conservation and an increase in protected areas as a result of understanding the value of sound and listening. And really at the heart of this has been looking at the most accessible, engaging, and inclusive ways to work directly with local communities to continue expanding and extending this work. So this launched with our very first residency in 2012 in the Noosa Biosphere Reserve, with a number of artists and scientists joining us. And we've really connected with that global network of biosphere reserves, looking at the potential of working locally with local impact, but globally connected. And from a creative perspective, the focus on sharing those recordings has been core to me as someone with a creative background and still incredibly passionate about the creative possibilities of sharing bioacoustic and ecoacoustic work in these immersive environments. This has always been critical to biosphere soundscapes and all of the projects I'm engaging with. This idea of an image like this one, creating an immersive concert essentially of underwater recordings in this context, where listeners in the community are able to connect with an ecosystem that they may not traditionally have access to. This idea of bringing hydrophone recordings together that are used for scientific research and environmental monitoring, bringing them together in this immersive creative context that allows people to connect with this ecosystem in new ways. And I've been running various research projects looking at the value of these experiences in connecting to communities to place, but also the well-being benefits of listening to environmental soundscapes, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end of this presentation as well. So this is an example of one of the Biosphere Soundscapes installations too. This is a geodesic dome on Mooloolaba Beach, not far from where I am now. And this dome has multi-channel surround sound inside it and immersive projections. And this was connecting to live hydrophones in the ocean just behind us, and included a live mix of underwater recordings. This was basically a project called Listening Underwater that enabled the local community to book into these listening underwater sessions, come and become immersed in the dome, and actually listen to the ocean in real time, and also listen to this live mix of recordings from our hydrophone database. Now, this was right around this time of year, a tiny bit later, so during the migration season for humpback whales, and this enabled us to connect with this real-time soundscape of whales on their southern migration across southeast Queensland, and a pretty powerful way to connect the community to those soundscapes in real time. And so that's something, that element of connecting live and in real time is something that I'm continuing to explore. This idea of developing mobile applications and locative media experiences has also been a huge focus in our community engagement, because these experiences basically enable us to geolocate, so geotag recordings in our databases, and then plant those in urban environments that allows communities to connect to them and listen to them in new ways. Now, there's a spectrum of locative media projects happening across the planet at the moment, and we've been working on these engagement tools through projects like Biosphere Soundscapes for over a decade now. And what I always find really rewarding and exciting about creating these locative media projects is it means that communities have access to the recordings resulting from a research project, can connect to that place in new ways, and it's incredibly accessible for various people in the community, including children who might not necessarily come to a gallery exhibition of the recordings, or might not engage with the recordings on a website, for example. And so, as an example of this, I've done a lot of work in the Central Amazon Biosphere Reserve, recording both terrestrial recordings and aquatic recordings as well in the Amazon River. And so, as an example of one of these creative outcomes, in 2015 for Climate Week in New York City, we created a sound map of the Amazon over Times Square, and you were able to access that and listen to the changing soundscapes of the rainforest as you walked throughout Times Square, connecting to that database of recordings. And in this context, some of the more unique recordings, such as howler monkeys or pink river dolphins, were hidden throughout Times Square. So you had to actually invest in the experience and work to hear these recordings and connect with the Amazon. And this was intentionally quite a harsh juxtaposition with the multisensory environment of Times Square in New York, juxtaposed with these fragile and rich and diverse recordings from the Amazon rainforest, and really exploring this idea of what does it mean to connect and listen and invest time in understanding these soundscapes in such an intense environment. And it was quite an interesting experience running sessions in Times Square during Climate Week, because a lot of people are walking around with headphones anyway. That's kind of just the natural state of Times Square. But it was really fascinating to be able to kind of pick the people in the crowd who were perhaps just wandering around talking on their phone or listening to a podcast, and people who were actually listening to these Amazon soundscapes. You could almost see a different manner about them, walking slower, more engaged as they were walking throughout the city. So a fascinating experience in itself. And as Ben mentioned in the introduction, I guess one of our largest creative projects as an outcome from Biosphere Soundscapes has been working with the Eiffel Tower as part of COP21. And this kind of grew out of the work that I was doing in the Amazon and the Times Square piece, in really looking at what would be a way that we can bring bioacoustics, ecoacoustics in a global engagement context to COP21, which, is still one of the most significant climate action events we've had on the planet to date. Such a significant meeting where there was so much positive energy in the lead up to this, and so there was many forums and discussions around the future of the Amazon rainforest. And so what I was really passionate about doing is finding ways for the community and local decision makers and global decision makers to be able to connect and listen to the Amazon, this location that they were making decisions about, and many that hadn't physically been there and had that experience deep in the rainforest. So we basically mapped the 4 distinctive layers of rainforest soundscapes over those 4 platforms of the Eiffel Tower, and encouraged people who were going to the Eiffel Tower anyway, to be honest, as part of their visit to Paris, encourage them to really engage with listening to the Amazon as part of this experience. And that was, again, quite a unique experiment in just seeing how people engaged. And what was particularly powerful about this, from my perspective, is there were a lot of voices missing from COP. And so I worked very closely with some of the communities that we've been engaging with through Biosphere Soundscapes, including many of the Indigenous elders that I've been working with, and had their permission to include their voices in these soundscapes so that their voices were amplified through this meeting at COP, and decision makers were able to listen to the Amazon rainforest, but also listen to the voices of community leaders and Indigenous elders, which was really important for me. And I guess that idea of collective listening and creating these experiences where people can access soundscapes through their phone, but where I also bring people together in these collective listening experiences, has been a really big part of what we do in terms of community engagement and outcomes. This is often a real-time listening experience where we have live hydrophones in the water and perhaps microphones in the rainforest canopy, and walk around while I'm mixing these in real time. I collaborate a lot with First Nations artists in these experiences as well. This is Brent Miller, Gubby Gubby artist, playing didgeridoo as part of the Welcome to Country in one of our sound walks in the Sunshine Coast Biosphere Reserve. And in this experience, we had live hydrophones in the water. This is just near the river mouth. And Brent was playing didgeridoo into the water, which you can then hear in real time through the hydrophones. So I always find these experiences of bringing that connection and liveness, especially at the start of a sonic experience, to be really powerful, because of course the minute you drop the hydrophones in the water and people are listening to the crackling and popping of snapping shrimp, it feels a little bit like an abstract foreign soundscape that's not necessarily happening in real time. But the minute you hear that didgeridoo kind of mixed into the soundscape and that real-time sensory engagement with our environment, I find the community becomes completely immersed in that deep listening experience. And I also do these sound walks through urban environments as well, in looking at bringing back some of the sound databases from the past. So this example here, the new Maroochydore city, not far from where I am now, which has been cleared, and there's buildings basically going up in this area as we speak. And this was an area that was quite an active wetland in the past. So I've actually planted those recordings from the wetland back at this location so the community can listen to what this place did sound like. And for me, these locative media experiences are also about connecting to place in real time. What does the weather and the environmental conditions really do in terms of affecting our soundscape? We know from a field recording perspective and a scientific perspective that has a huge impact. And so I'm really interested in embedding some of that responsiveness to environmental conditions into the listening experiences for communities as well. So this is an example of the listening underwater sound walks, where all of the content is geolocated along Mooloolaba Beach. And as you can see from this image here, the idea is that listeners are intended to basically walk right along the edge of the water with their shoes off and their feet in the water to connect to those soundscapes. And in this experience, the sounds actually move with the tide. So it basically, when the tide goes out, the sounds go further along the ocean. So they're responding to the tides and encouraging you to connect with the water. And there's also an accessible, wheelchair accessible version of this, which sits up along the pathway basically. So it enables the experience to be completely accessible for everyone in the community who wants to engage. But that connection with real-time environmental conditions is something that is now a big part of a lot of the work that I'm engaging with now. And in parallel to these site-specific outdoor experiences, I've also invested a lot in creating these gallery experiences, whether they're deep listening immersive domes in a gallery or headphone experiences and interactive experiences that enable people in a traditional gallery and museum environment to connect to these databases of recordings and resulting soundscapes and compositions. Now, I mentioned that real-time connection and liveness has been a big focus of Biosphere Soundscapes in the last few years, and I wanted to mention this particular initiative, which is very much a collaboration between Biosphere Soundscapes, Locus Sonus in France, and Soundcamp in London in particular, which is basically a real-time network of open microphones in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. These were the series of sites here that we launched as pilot locations from 2017 to 2020, which basically set the foundations for the project. And we've developed this quite significantly since over the past few years in looking at really accessible live streaming kits in collaboration with Soundcamp that can be distributed in biosphere reserves across the world, run and managed by communities to listen in real time. And so these real-time streams can naturally be used for research and biodiversity monitoring. They become open source to be used for multiple purposes, but they're this real-time portal into biosphere reserves and a fantastic way to connect that global network of biosphere reserves. And this has been a really positive experience in exploring that kind of compelling nature of real-time listening, and also how that real-time engagement can perhaps solve some of the problems that we've had in the past around databasing huge amounts of audio recordings, especially when we're working with ambisonic recordings or multi-channel recordings across multiple weeks, months, sometimes years. This idea of real-time listening and essentially just databasing aspects of that stream has become a really positive way to engage. This is just a screenshot from the Locus Sonus sound map to show some of the active sites during major events such as Reveille, which some of you may be familiar with as the 24-hour broadcast that tracks dawn in real time around the planet, which happens on International Dawn Chorus Day every year. That's been running for 11 years now and is led by Soundcamp in London, and a really, I guess, exciting project for the global bioacoustics community to connect and listen to the entire planet in real time and really explore what a dawn chorus means. And so this year for Reveille, we launched a new series of streams in the network of biosphere reserves that I currently live and work in here in Australia. So the Noosa Biosphere Reserve, which was the first biosphere reserve recognised in southeast Queensland in this region. The Great Sandy Biosphere Reserve, which has Gari, Fraser Island in the centre of it, which is also a World Heritage Site. And finally, the Sunshine Coast Biosphere Reserve, which has some incredible marine ecosystems around it, and Old Woman Island just off the coast, which is very close to where we launched this temporary stream and where we'll eventually have a permanent live stream in this biosphere reserve. And this is also a transition point during the migration season for humpback whale. So we'll be a live listening point for the humpback whale migration as well. And so these new series of streams were launched in the three biosphere reserves right here on the Sunshine Coast, Great Sandy, and Noosa, as a way to experiment and start positioning this region as the hub of where a lot of the biosphere soundscapes work is now happening. And you can see this is actually one of the only regions in the world where we have three coastal biosphere reserves touching boundaries, so right beside each other off the coast here. And the University of the Sunshine Coast, the university where I'm currently based, basically has campuses across all of these biosphere reserves, which is pretty exciting as well. So I guess just to recap on where Biosphere Soundscapes is at the moment, this is a project that has taken various different forms over the last 11 years, and currently basically from last year moving into 2025, I've been focused on four key aspects of this project. And I guess one of the key things has been, I've been really inspired by this global engagement in bioacoustics. I think we're seeing so much more respect for this field and so much more rich engagement happening across the planet. And, that's partly in thanks to, I think, the accessibility and the affordability of recording technologies as well, meaning things like the audio moth and other devices that are available can be put in the hands of community members and can be used in a really accessible and inclusive way. And that's, I think, quite game changing for the global uptake of this field. And so a big focus for me has been, really looking at ethical, responsible, and regenerative research projects with biosphere reserves that really have listening at the core. I think with any field that's really starting to generate a lot more global engagement, there is a number of projects in different parts of the world now with a sound focus that perhaps don't have that ethics and responsibility at the core of them. So I've been really passionate to ensure that everything that we're doing through Biosphere Soundscapes is ethical and has that regenerative and sustainability focus at the core. I'm really passionate about ensuring that a lot of the work that we're doing is Indigenous-led and community-led research projects. So for me, in many cases, with some of the biosphere reserves we've been working with, in Mexico, for example, that's really meant standing back, letting the community naturally lead the project, but really coming in as a network and as a project when we're needed to support areas that are required, but essentially setting up those connections and points and then standing back and ensuring that the community has that agency to lead the project. That idea that I mentioned earlier around keeping the aspects of the project really locally focused and responsive and agile in how they're designed, but globally connected with this network. The biome streaming project that I mentioned, so that really strong focus on the network of open microphones and accessible live streams. And then this notion of being really responsive and collaborative in how we're working, and reciprocity being really at the heart of this. We've been looking at these different models of research reciprocity, both within a university context and a community context, but really looking at what ecological reciprocity means as a tool for research design, but how we can be influenced from a biomimicry perspective and a reciprocity in an ecological reciprocity perspective in how we design and deliver some of these projects. So I just wanted to, I guess, highlight those points as some of the core ideas that I'm really focused on in Biosphere Soundscapes at the moment. And that's essentially meant that last year I really started to shift the focus within the local context to purely this idea of monitoring and engagement through sound, to this notion of regeneration, restoration, and collaboration. And so that's meant some really exciting new projects that have been evolving, a number of collaborations with um, Monica Gagliano, who's an incredible plant bioacoustic specialist who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I'm working with Monica around some of these ideas of acoustic regeneration and restoration. And so that's been another really interesting expansion of Biosphere Soundscapes over the last couple of years, which is all framed around this, I guess, importance and value of partnerships and collaboration at the core of all of these projects. So this idea of kind of building these custom technologies and live streams has been the core focus over the last 6 months, and we've been developing different ways to build really accessible hydrophone recording kits and streaming kits, and working directly with Soundcamp in London on these stream boxes. This is an example of the stream box that is in the canopy of Mary Cairncross Rainforest in the Sunshine Coast Biosphere Reserve. And you can see this is based off Raspberry Pi technology. So a Raspberry Pi, in this case, 4 microphones. This one runs as power over Ethernet. So an Ethernet, 100 meters of Ethernet running from the canopy down to the monitoring station and streaming in real time. These hydrophone kits run off battery and solar panels. We can also run them off Ethernet. And these smaller ones here, which I've been really excited about and quite similar to the ones that we've been using recently for that new network of streams, mean that we can power these off mobile internet and a battery and a solar panel, and these can go out into the water. And the setup at the moment will run on battery with no solar panel for 3 days. And if we add a solar panel, that will obviously run indefinitely with sun. And what I find also really exciting about this sort of kit and these collaborations with Soundcamp and Locus Sonus is this kind of kit we're looking at here can all be preset and ready to stream, to the point that I can post this to a remote part of the Philippines, and a community member that receives this, all they need to do is open the box and plug in the battery, and it's essentially connected directly to the sound map and streaming. So it means that this idea of setting up these live streams in different parts of the world is at this point really quite accessible and affordable. And I do want to talk a little bit as well about the aquatic focus of this research. I've spoken in detail about Biosphere Soundscapes, but I want to touch on 2 other projects: river listening and listening to country. And so river listening has been fundamentally about the value of hydrophones as a way to connect communities to what's happening beneath the surface of river systems. I've been really inspired by the fact that, you know, we can see what's happening in terrestrial environments. We can see changes in the trees along this river system, but we have no idea what's happening beneath the surface. So we have this situation globally where dramatic changes in aquatic environments, rivers in particular, are often going unnoticed simply due to visibility. And so I've been really passionate over the last 10 years about how hydrophones can be a tool for us to connect to river systems, understand what's happening beneath the surface, and really engage with monitoring river health in a non-invasive, accessible, and affordable way. And so that was really the foundation of river listening. I've been really lucky to work with some incredible scientists, including Simon Linke, who's now one of the world's leaders of freshwater ecoacoustics, to really explore the possibilities of bioacoustics and ecoacoustics as a tool to monitor river health. And we've been really lucky to run these experiments and explorations in different river systems across the world, from frozen rivers in Norway to very polluted rivers in China, to the Mary River not far from where I am right now, where we've really looked at different approaches to research design for ecoacoustics recording, different ways to engage the community in the process, and really exploring what we can learn from listening to the environment. And in parallel to the community engagement and this research design at a local level in terms of our fieldwork, we've really invested in, I guess, pushing forward the ideas of freshwater ecoacoustics as well. So this was one of our first papers that was published, which Simon Linke led, which was really looking at positioning ecoacoustics as a tool for continuous ecosystem monitoring. And we've also invested in publishing the interdisciplinary frameworks and pathways in scientific journals, and then the scientific possibilities for recording in creative journals. So this is an example of one of the papers that was really looking at those interdisciplinary approaches to freshwater ecoacoustics and positioning the kind of design of river listening and our community engagement focus. So that's always been really critical for me as we're advancing the science and developing these collaborations, ensuring that we're really emphasizing that value of listening and community engagement and the importance of working at that community level. Likewise, I've developed a whole range of sound walks and locative media experiences working along the banks of river systems, very similar to the Biosphere Soundscapes experiences I mentioned earlier. And we've invested a really significant amount of time in engaging with young people in communities as well with river listening workshops. I found that I was running a lot of hydrophone river listening workshops, and a lot of young people would come to these workshops, and then we would finish the workshop and their parents would say to me, you know, where do we buy a hydrophone from? What shop can we buy a hydrophone from? And of course, hydrophones aren't all that accessible to buy from the corner store. So we really started to invest in designing these workshops where students could spend the morning actually making a hydrophone and then spend the afternoon using the hydrophone in the river and then basically having that hydrophone to take home. And this has been happening for a number of years now and had some, really great results in that some of these students now have gone on to study freshwater ecoacoustics at university and are really engaging with this field of bioacoustics. And I'm always incredibly inspired by how engaged young people are in the process of field recording and how, enthralled young people are as well around the sounds beneath the surface in a project like this. And that's been really critical for me in all of these projects, is to create really accessible pathways for young people to be able to engage with bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. The reality is now this technology is incredibly accessible, inclusive and affordable. So it's not difficult to have recorders out in the hands of young people in schools. So we've been looking at these different models of ensuring that recording equipment is accessible to local schools in the biosphere reserves, especially in the region I'm working now. And also then looking at the kind of health and well-being benefits of listening back to those soundscapes in a learning context as well. What does it mean for a school group to monitor everything that lives in their local lake through sound, and then actually bring those soundscapes back into the classroom as a deep listening and well-being tool? So that's also a big focus of what we're doing at the moment. And that's a segue into the final project I wanted to touch on, which is called Listening to Country. And that really has that well-being focus at the heart of it. And so this project has been about exploring the value of acoustic ecology with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison. And the focus of this has been drawing on the database of bioacoustic, ecoacoustic recordings throughout southeast Queensland and in some cases a bit further, and looking at how those sounds can be a tool for well-being and connection to country for people living in social isolation. So particularly for First Nations people in prison. And this project really started and was a catalyst for when I was working on the sound design and composition for a feature film called Larka, working in southeast Arnhem Land. And during the production of this film, I was working with elders in the community and basically being directed to particular locations. And so this was all shot on country in Arnhem Land. And when I was talking to the community members, they were sending me to very specific sites and essentially saying, if you drive out to this particular area, cross this field and walk down the gully, you'll land at this particular lake. And if you sit at this area, you'll be able to hear the sound of the reeds through the trees and the geese calling over the water. So these kind of really vivid descriptions of soundscapes. And what I became really fascinated with in this process is the elders that I was working with had spent a lot of time at these locations. They had very distinct and vivid memories of exactly what it sounded like, but they were no longer in a position to physically visit these locations. So they were describing these soundscapes to me, describing the memory of these soundscapes. I was going and recording them and then bringing them back for these elders to listen to. And this project kind of shifted from producing sound design for this feature film to shifting into really looking at how sound was this tool for memory and connection to a place that they could no longer physically get to. And so for me, that was kind of the foundation of an idea around the value that bioacoustics and ecoacoustics has as this well-being tool for people as they're getting older, in particular, to connect to those memories of places that made them feel very connected to the environment and to place, and what it really means then to bring those soundscapes back to people that might be living in social isolation or no longer able to access those soundscapes. And so that was a catalyst for me working on a virtual reality project with the MPY Women's Council and Uti Kulanjaku, which is a collective of Indigenous elders and traditional healers in Central Australia, where we were looking at the value of sound as a tool for connection, to share with people, to inspire them to reconnect to country, looking at creating soundscapes as part of these First Nations meditation apps, again, as this tool for well-being and connection to country, and then coming back to this Listening to Country project, which was about going into the Brisbane Women's Prison and working directly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who were in this remand centre and creating these recordings of different locations and bringing them back into the prison. And so we then composed these soundscapes together in the prison that became this well-being tool for the women in the prison to be able to listen to and feel connected to country. And what was quite powerful about this process as well is, as you can see in this image, the women in the prison wanted to have that agency in the recordings and add their own soundscapes in there, the sounds of their footsteps, the sounds of their voice and heartbeat, to allow them to kind of feel truly connected. And that's really been the catalyst in the last few years of thinking about the well-being benefits of listening to environmental soundscapes. When we're looking at these incredible databases of bioacoustic recordings across the world, some of which are literally just living on servers and hard drives for environmental monitoring. At the early stages of this research, I've been passionate about how we can create these community engagement pathways to enable people to listen to these soundscapes. But now I'm equally passionate about how these soundscapes can really be a tool for well-being and potentially in a hospital context as well. When we look at something like an infusion clinic, I've spent a lot of time in infusion clinics, and I'm always quite interested in this idea that a doctor will, essentially say that the treatment will work best if you're calm and relaxed. Yet when we think about the soundscapes of a hospital environment, you couldn't find anything that's more contrasting to the ideas of relaxed and calm when you've got things beeping, people running around, that intensity of the soundscape. And so this idea that we can perhaps draw on these environmental soundscapes to create that well-being environment, I think there's some really exciting possibilities there. And also that notion of bringing soundscapes from people's homes into an aged care facility, perhaps palliative care as well, to enable people to connect to environments and, create that sense of connection and calmness in someone's bodies that's perhaps quite unwell. So that's a huge contrast to the early focus of this work, but something that I'm really passionate about now. And I just wanted to mention, just to close, a project that we are leading as part of the listening to country work more broadly, this idea of connection to country through sound that has been developed and conceived by Lyndon Davis, who I mentioned right at the start of this presentation as being a really important collaborator on biosphere soundscapes and river listening. And this is a project where we've been looking at cymatics and bioacoustics. So this idea that we can connect to patterns in the environment through sound. And Lyndon was really fascinated by this notion that cymatics, so the visualization of sound, would connect and correlate with gubby patterns and designs in the region, with the bioacoustic call of particular species. And so we've been experimenting with cymatics, recording different totem species in the region, and then essentially playing back those sounds and experimenting with the visualization of those sounds. And we've created this digital cymatics tool. And so if we look at these images here of black cockatoos here in the Sunshine Coast Biosphere Reserve, when we take a recording, a call of the black cockatoo, and essentially play it through that photograph using generative visualization software, this is the image that we get. So this is basically the call of a black cockatoo played through that photograph of the black cockatoo, which is quite a fascinating image. And likewise, this is the same image, same call played through, just zoomed out quite a bit. And what's really fascinating here is we start to see the geometric patterns and designs that are really significant in this region. That image that you can see right in the middle of this pattern is what Lyndon Davis referenced as a gubby shield design. And so it's kind of remarkable that this computational process has revealed these patterns and connections in the region, and this notion that, we can truly connect the dots between Indigenous knowledge systems, computational processes, and revealing this sense of interconnection. And that's really been at the core of all of these projects, is how listening and connection to place and community can be this tool to either reignite or facilitate this sense of ecological connection and care. And so the Bialy project at the moment, the image of the black cockatoo, that's extended to different species on Gubbi Gubbi country, including underwater, in particular the humpback whale, which is Talobilla in Gubbi Gubbi. So we've been working on this Talobilla project for about a year now, so it's quite a fresh project. And last year we had this idea, late last year, again as this way to connect the community to sounds beneath the surface, to actually have a live hydrophone in the water and project the cymatic visualization of humpback whale song onto this island. So this is Old Woman Island, which looks quite small in this photograph, but it's actually quite big. This is Lyndon when we were out searching for whales and installing our hydrophones. And this is the boat that we used for the event. This is Sunreef, one of our partners here in the Sunshine Coast Biosphere Reserve. This was the moment that we had live whales singing on the hydrophones. This is a collaboration with Trisha King as well, who you can see reflected there holding the camera. And this was when we were basically playing didgeridoo back on the boat and listening to these live whales. And you can see here, it's a slightly grainy photograph, but this was the projection of Lyndon's artwork over Old Woman Island with those real-time visualizations of humpback whale song, live hydrophones in the water. Now, this was, I think, one of the more ambitious creative ideas and outcomes from these ways to connect to biosphere soundscapes, but a powerful project for the local community to really think about and connect with sound in a completely new way. It's not an easy project to pull off. There were a lot of environmental conditions we had to respond to, especially with a projector on a moving boat, but a really exciting and valuable project for the local community to connect to Talabilla humpback whale in a new way. And this was Lyndon's Talabilla painting. And so it was the sound of the humpback whale that was played through this painting. So that pretty much brings me to the end. And I just wanted to close by saying, as I mentioned earlier, as much as I'm talking about quite interdisciplinary research, research that has that scientific intentions at the heart of it, but is highly interdisciplinary and community focused, and has really I've really focused the presentation today around touching on some of those creative possibilities, the value of sharing our work directly with communities in creative ways to inspire them to connect. And I wanted to close by emphasizing again that I think one of the most exciting areas of this field at the moment is to embed aspects of our projects, of our research in local curriculum with schools. Bioacoustics can really fit across the spectrum of outdoor education, science, music, community engagement. So I find that teachers are really responsive to this field, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to continue expanding and extending the possibilities of bioacoustics, acoustic ecology globally by truly engaging young people in the process. I think I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Oh my. Um, so I'd really like to thank you, Leah, and at this point, open up the floor for anyone with questions or feedback about the work Leah showed.
I might have just a quick question. Uh, First of all, wonderful presentation. And it brought back some memories too, just with the sensual perceptions, whether it be hearing, smell, or sight. It reminded me when I used to, when I wanted to go places that I couldn't get to at that moment, I would really think about them in my mind. And it almost felt like sometimes I could smell, see, and hear the sounds of that place, right? And it would bring, I don't know, these different feelings, right? And when I hear about these different technologies coming out at the beginning, I was wondering maybe they'll get to the point where they simulate these realities where you can actually experience that Amazon rainforest, not just with the sound, but with visuals and everything. So it's kind of interesting to compare these mental projections we put out versus these new technological ones too. And the question is scientifically now, like I wonder while you guys are doing these projects, studying people listening to these sounds in different environments, what kind of maybe brain activity that would bring to people if you see different brain development happening or different areas being activated, different healing going on, different neurons firing kind of while listening to the technology versus I know what like when it comes to say those more I guess you could say meditative practices where you try and close your eyes, put yourself in a place and take yourself there mentally. if there would be any correlation between the two, just sort of a mental projection with versus a technological one.
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's such a fascinating area at the moment because we're seeing more and more evidence around the well-being benefits of soundscapes. I mean, just in a simple form, you know, you can kind of observe in less than 5 minutes of deep listening, you know, someone's heart rate slow down, blood pressure reduce slightly, so you can kind of see these real-time well-being measures, and then when we look at the potential long-term benefits of that from a mental health perspective as well. I mean, certainly that listening to country project that I mentioned, the one bringing soundscapes into prisons, it was pretty remarkable to hear the interviews with the women we were working with a month after and a couple of months after. And these were some of the women that we were working with who had reoffended intentionally to get back into prison because that's where they felt connected, and perhaps that's also where some of their family and friends were. Some of these women were now really passionate about getting back to country and reconnecting with the place that, you know, made them really feel connected. And so just to kind of see, I guess, those long-term well-being benefits of engaging with soundscapes was pretty powerful as well. I think your question around, you know, I guess the kind of, you know, using your imagination to simulate that deep listening experience versus digital technology is a really interesting one, because I think we can kind of simulate that deep listening through our memory if we've had those experiences. But I think what's really interesting is, you know, when someone is in that context of social isolation. And I think what confronted me the most about working in a prison and also working in hospitals as well is that soundscape is so intense. Like, you kind of can't escape it. So, you know, thinking about the prison, there was just constant alarms going off and people yelling. And so I don't think that environment in particular, I don't think is conducive to really activating your imagination, because there's so many distractions. So that idea of a digital experience can truly, you know, draw you out of that environment and immerse you. So I think those kind of digital virtual experiences are incredibly valuable in those contexts where you are in social isolation and you can't kind of escape that soundscape that you're in, that is quite juxtaposed to the sorts of soundscapes that we're talking about. And yeah, the kind of virtual potential at the moment, I think, is really quite really quite exciting. And I think we're now seeing the true value of things like ambisonic recordings and binaural recordings. You know, early in Biosphere Soundscapes, we did a lot of multi-channel recording, and I often had, you know, we would kind of have these heated discussions and sometimes arguments in that sort of balance between art and science, when some of my scientific collaborators were saying, you know, from a bioacoustics perspective, a mono recording that's compressed, if we're doing a 3-day recording, is completely sufficient for environmental monitoring, which in many cases it is. But when we create that fully surround sound ambisonic spatial, you know, audio, when we're listening back to that in a virtual environment, you know, we can truly kind of head track that and move around the environment in quite a unique way as well. Anyway, I could talk about that all day, but hopefully I've answered your question.
You did. Thank you very much for taking the time and giving the insight. Wonderful presentation again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Pars. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Leah? I see a lot of really positive feedback in the chat. Leah, be sure to check that out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hello.
Oh, hi, Destiny. Why don't you
Hi.
go first and then we'll go to David.
All right, so I'm looking at how she managed to connect with the people before establishing the project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. So from a Biosphere Soundscapes perspective, um, I was quite lucky in that I worked for and with UNESCO for a number of years. So I had some existing connections with the network of biosphere reserves, and I made, I guess, a point of sharing information about the project, but then only going to communities where we were invited, essentially, where the local community saw value in the research. So, for example, in Mexico, working with the Siancam Biosphere Reserve, that actually came out of one of our international internship programs. I was working with a Mexican artist, and so he was able to facilitate those connections with the local community. And that's been the case for basically all locations with biosphere soundscapes and river listening. It's come through a initial relationship with someone in the community who's seen value and opportunity for the project at a local level. I've never wanted to go into a location and kind of propose my own ideas and my own vision for how it might work in that community. It's been, I guess, and that was the biggest learning process for me early in some of the design of these initiatives is it will be different everywhere. I mean, the design of a project in terms of a structure and a focus and an approach to recording will need to be responsive and agile to each community we're working with based on the questions, the environmental questions that community really has. So I guess that's where collaboration and reciprocity has been really key again, and it's always been about that invitation from a community to collaborate for me. Yeah.
Beautiful.
David?
That's great. Thanks, man. Thanks, Leah. That was man, left me with about 5 different veins of thought going on. Where we are, we're in the boreal forest of Canada, with Cree Ojibwe people, reconnecting to the land after 100 years of genocide and the Indian Act in northern Canada. And I can see probably a lot of value in this. Like you said, from the healing perspective, because our jails are filled with incarcerated Indigenous people here in Canada as well at an alarming rate. So that could be a very interesting pathway from the health side. One of the areas we are working on, though, is nature-based solutions, and we're running acoustic sampling to look at ecosystem health and abundance. Post spraying, post harvesting, that across that range. But the dynamics of sound recording, because it sounds like what you just said. I'm not a sound expert, so there's basic sound recordings, but if I got it right, you said there was like multiple layers of sound that can be recorded in a session. So how does that work? Like, what technology is that gets you the highest level of the maximum amount of recording that you're doing in these natural spaces? Like, could you just give me the lightning rod of what that is? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so as I mentioned, we use the kind of, accessible devices like the Frontier Labs bar recorder or the Audio Moth. I mean, the Audio Moth, I guess, as a comparison, is obviously very small and lightweight and is mono, so a single channel recording, whereas a lot of the more sophisticated recordings we're doing are ambisonic, so fully surround sound. So as an example of that, the kind of smallest, most accessible ambisonic field recorder is made by Zoom. I can drop the link in the chat if you like. And
Great.
that one, I guess in comparison, if we're looking at long-term field work, it's not necessarily something that we would be leaving out in the field for weeks on end. You
Right.
can basically power it with, I'll just drop this one in the chat. You can power it with a solar panel and a battery. But essentially, what I would generally do if we're installing a bunch of audio moths, I would install something like the Zoom H3 VR for a 2-day recording. So we've got kind of a solid 48 hours of spatial audio from that location. And I might do that multiple times across a week. And likewise, using other ambisonic microphones or binaural microphones as well. So I use, I'll drop this in the chat as well, a 3DO binaural microphone. Let me just grab this one. And so this will work with a sound devices or a Zoom recorder. It's just got 2 XLRs that you would plug into your recorder. And so what's unique about that recording, it's I guess it's still creating just 2 channels of audio, but what's unique about it is because it's binaural, so shaped as our ears and able to recreate the soundscape exactly as we hear it. And so I find that a really powerful way to record a location from an engagement perspective, because when someone's listening back to it, they're able to feel like they're actually present and connected. A bee flies around the microphones and it feels incredibly realistic. Whereas if that was purely the recording from the audio moth, yes, we can use that audio moth data to know that there's a bee there and know the species of bees there. But when we're playing that back in an immersive listening context, the compression on the audio and the fact that it's just single channel mono doesn't give us that same sense of immersion and connection. Yeah.
So cool. Very cool. Thank you.
No worries. Was there any more questions?
Yeah, I may have a concern.
Hi, Gonwo.
Hi, Ben. So, yeah, well, my concern is first, Leah, very, very good presentation. It was very, very instructive. My concern is you kept mentioning communities with whom you did most of your work. And my concern is mostly concerning the African continent, where communities are more less educated than many other parts of the world where you've been doing your work. I'm more concerned about you extending your work in Africa and maybe seeing how community will easily or maybe adopt whatever the type of the sound recording and the importance of this recording in Africa, if that makes sense, please.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you're absolutely right. There has been, not a significant amount of engagement with Africa through this research. And it's certainly something that we're aware of, and we're keen to make those connections and perhaps expand the project there. We've had some of the live streams in African biosphere reserves, but certainly with that on the ground community engagement, that hasn't really unfolded yet to the degree that it could. So I'm very open to collaborations and potentially expanding. And I've got a couple of PhD students at the moment that have indicated that they want to focus some of their biosphere soundscapes research in that part of the world. So it certainly would be something I'd be keen to chat about further. And definitely, I acknowledge that there's certainly some gaps in the locations that we've been working with as well.
Yeah. So thank you, Leah. I will be very happy to collaborate in such a research if you are willing to. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Gonwo is a researcher specializing in amphibians and is working in an area where there's possibly new species and many endangered amphibians in Cameroon. So that would be great. And if you're interested in getting in touch with Leah and learning more about her work, do you have your contact email accessible where people could send you a message if they're interested in
Yeah, for sure. I'll drop it in the chat as well. And I just saw David's comment as well about accessing some of the sounds. So the Biosphere Soundscapes website is where we host most things. The sound maps for that I was talking about, the database and sound map is currently being redeveloped at the moment, so it's not online, but it will be back online soon. So it's just biospheresoundscapes.org. I'll drop that in the chat as well. And yeah, all of the sound and documentation will be back up there soon.
Incredible, generous. Thank you.
Okay, this was so fantastic. Leah, thank you so much for taking the time to share the incredible work that you've been doing with all your collaborators. And yeah, we'll all be staying tuned to listen more and learn more about your work, and hope we can stay in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming, everyone.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.